monitoring solution under their belt that they can use to see what their code is doing.
Yeah, I'd recommend that. And now that Fusion Reactor's gone to a monthly subscription pricing as well as just being able to purchase the software, I think their lowest price things like I want to say $39 a month, which is you try getting a cup of coffee every day for $1 something a day,
Do that. Well, see, Fusion Reactor also has a developer license if you're going to only use it for your developer workstation, not on a production web server. And I think it's $200. I think it's $199 a year, which is much cheaper than their typical pricing as well.
Yeah, I think their regular thing's about 1,500 or something like that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of options, and in my opinion, they're well worth the time you're going to spend.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's move forward. Question 31. What kind of deployments are folks doing? Lots of tools people could use on deployments. Most popular one is deploying in-house.
Yeah.
And second one is on managed servers. So those are where the deployment's going to, which is a slightly different question, right? But this is a multi-choice question. So and shared hosting was kind of behind on that. So
it should be. It needs to die in a fire.
Why is that, Brad, in your opinion?
I always hated shared hosting because you're sharing a server, right, with other websites, and they've usually got the security locked down, to where it's nearly unusable, or the security isn't locked down, which means that you're not very well separated from the other servers.
Yeah, I mean, to put this in a metaphor, shared hosting is sort of like you're going to a youth hostel dormitory and you're with all the other people, and if someone gets drunk and throws up on the bunk bed, you're screwed. And then managed servers more like an apartment complex, where there are other apartments, but they're kind of firewalled off from each other. Whether that's virtual private server or a dedicated machine.
Well, we have VPS. We have VPS.
Like you built your own house. So,
so we have VPS on here. So a VPS is somebody manages the hardware, but you install everything you want, including ColdFusion.
So that's like having an apartment complex, and you have a separate apartment, and then managed servers like
VPS is like you have to furnish your apartment and fix the faucet when it leaks.
Right. Whereas managed server is you've built your own house, or the ISP built one for you, and it's totally separate from anyone else.
I like this. We need just to run this analogy out until it breaks.
Yes, Trump tire would be no way. I can't quite come up with an analogy of that. But let's move on to the other deployment question, which is: do you use some software to do your deployments? And I think the number one solution there is Docker. So tell us why someone would want to use Docker.
Well, see, I think Docker isn't necessarily mutually exclusive with a number of these. For instance, Kubernetes is more of an orchestration layer on top of Docker. In fact, Heroku and Doku are even sort of layers on top of Docker as well. Docker is very attractive, and what I see right now in the cloud world is everything is trending towards Docker in some form or another. I actually, we just had a call today with the guys at Cloud Foundry, managed by Pivotal, just to kind of look at some of their offerings, and their stuff is heavily based around a lot of Docker options. But it's the idea that you can, kind of completely separate the server that you're installing your code onto, from the application itself. So you have this little precious snowflake of an application that you bundle up in this nice little package, and you can just say deploy 10 of these. And some of the orchestration layers on top of Docker are very convincing, to be able to say, if the load of my application reaches a certain threshold, deploy 2 more servers with automatic load balancing between them. That gives a level of flexibility that's unheard of in the on-house category. In my opinion, my personal opinion, I think this question right here is where the ColdFusion space has some of the most to grow in the future. I think the ColdFusion is really lagging behind in this area of deployments. If you were to look at the same question in other major languages like Ruby or Node, Grails, I think a lot of those communities would much less favor in-house, but instead they would be doing things like Heroku, they would be doing things like Docker-based deployments, Kubernetes. Though I think to a degree, maybe some of the ColdFusion shops that are government, that have very tight restrictions on where they're allowed to run, quite possibly a lot of these just aren't options for them. based on the
Well,
red tape.
couldn't they go onto a private cloud that they control?
They could, and I guess maybe that's what they mean by in-house. They would probably have to be a
No,
bit more
I'm pretty
advanced.
sure. I'm pretty sure in-house means they actually have the hardware in a room in the office
Sure. I mean,
building.
it's a lot of these like Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes is available, via just a hosted solution, Google Cloud Services. You can also
Mhm.
run your own, Kubernetes clusters effectively in-house. Though I don't know, I don't think nearly as many people are doing that. Um,
And then Vagrant is a similar idea to Docker, but why? And
yeah.
that's pretty
So
popular. So,
Vagrant can have provisioners that would point to any kind of cloud service like Rackspace and things like that. But 99% of everybody that I know using Vagrant are using it specifically for local development. Vagrant is for
mhm,
provisioning virtual machines, VMs, right?
mhm,
And Docker is for provisioning containers. And so a
mhm,
container is much more lightweight than an
mhm.
entire virtual machine. It's faster to provision. Typing Vagrant up from scratch might take 15 minutes. Bringing up a Docker instance might take 30 seconds. So I see Docker as the next logical evolution of Vagrant. In fact, when you install Docker today on a Windows machine, it actually
Mhm.
installs VirtualBox and deploys a single uh, virtual machine to it that then the Docker containers run inside of. So I think Vagrant is still very compelling for local development, but I think it's being overtaken by Docker just
And
due to the
when you say container, for people who don't quite know what that means, why would you want a container to run your ColdFusion in?
Right. So a virtual machine, like what Vagrant creates for you by default on a tool like VirtualBox, is a full installation of an operating system that's booted up from scratch on virtual hardware, right? So you assign RAM to it, you assign CPUs to it, you boot all the way from, a virtualized BIOS up to, a Linux installation. Um, Docker, when we say process, it's literally just a process running inside of a Linux operating system, or I think the latest versions of Windows 10 support this natively. So when you spin up a new Docker container, you just have a base Linux operating system running, and it's literally just a matter of saying spawn this new process. And inside of that is a little encapsulated, Linux thing that's running, and it thinks it's its own machine, but it's really just one of many processes running on a base hardware. So your density is much higher. The number of containers you can spin up, the time to spin them up is just a matter of seconds because you're not booting a full operating system from scratch. You're just saying, here's an existing, running OS, spin me off a new process. But yeah, it's a very kind of technical answer, but there's a lot of benefits to the container based in that it's just a process running on a base operating system. It's still very segregated system resource wise, but it's a lot more lightweight and faster than a full VM like Vagrant gives you.
So it could keep your applications separate from each other. If you've got a development server, you could have different containers that had different versions of ColdFusion or different databases or whatever you were testing.
Sure, yeah, there's base
Uh,
containers for everything
and
imaginable. In fact, we have command box based containers that you can just
Mhm.
say, I want to run Adobe ColdFusion 11, and that's what it spins up. And the idea with a container based approach is you have a container for each application, just little, separate deployable apps.
And the other thing is once you've configured the container, you can save it, off to disk, and then when you want to bring it back to life, you can just spin it up very quickly.
Yeah. So I expect to see Docker growing in the
Mhm.
future. And things like Kubernetes, Azure, EC2, I expect to see those all growing. At least I would like to see them grow. I would like to see the in-house bar get smaller as those get larger, because I think that really unlocks a new potential for people to scale applications that they just don't have in-house. Most
Right.
people in-house, if you said how long would it take you to put another web server online starting today, they might tell you 2 weeks, right?
Hmm.
Anybody using Kubernetes, you say how long would it take you to put another web server online, and they'd be like, I just did it. It's there, it's in production right now. It's a different world of deployment for sure.
And let's just talk a little bit about these different cloud servers, Amazon EC2 or Azure. Um,
Yeah, and so
because Amazon
EC2
seems
is
to
the
be.
only
Mhm.
cloud deployment option that's really natively supported by Adobe right now. They've promised us Docker containers, though I haven't seen it. I spoke with Alicia recently. I think she said they were working on them. EC2 is one of the only deployment options that really gives Adobe the ability to collect the pricing, because you pay per hour for your ColdFusion license and what they're doing. A lot of these options don't quite have the same control that EC2 does to be able to charge the customer per hour, per instance.
And if you wanted to use Amazon, you also could run Lucy on it, I assume.
Absolutely, yeah. Web appers worked on making gold certified AMIs for EC2. Lucy also has Heroku build packs. They have base Docker images you can build on. Obviously, with the licensing out of the picture, you don't have to worry nearly as much about your deployment licensing with Lucy as you do with Adobe ColdFusion.
Right. Though you would be paying by the hour to Amazon just for the server instances.
Sure, and I will add, I know that Adobe's working on some better cloud-based licensing. I was with some of the Adobe team members a few weeks ago, and I asked them about that, and they acknowledged that that's something the current EULA is sort of vague on, and it's something they're working on doing, because Adobe wants to be able to free people up to use these cloud offerings easier. The trick is that how do they know how much to charge you unless, especially things like Kubernetes, where the number of containers can just be spooling up and down throughout the day based on your site's usage. I mean, what the heck do you charge people for? I mean, how do you
just take the average? Right?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to handle it. So that's what I think they're working through with their legal team inside of Adobe, is figuring out how to.
I'm sure from the technical mathematical point of view, it would be pretty easy to come up with a fair answer. But as soon as you bring in the lawyers, they probably have to contemplate it for a while.
Sure.
So let's move on.
Yeah, that's my graph I want to keep my eyes on for next year. I want to see how it's changing. Sure.
Yeah. So question 32, what do you use to build REST APIs? So a lot of different things here. Number one is homegrown. And number two is we don't use REST.
I'm not incredibly surprised that there's a decent number of people not using REST. But I am disappointed to see how many people have grown their own. Most of the major frameworks all have, a REST implementation, with Taffy, Coldbox, Framework 1. And so it's kind of disappointing to think of the hours people have spent writing their own ability to do that, when there's these off-the-shelf, frameworks that probably could have saved them a large amount of time. I mean, even the CF built-in REST, which is generally regarded as not being that good, at least has decent usage, but it's not as many as the homegrown ones, which is a little surprising.
And just for those who aren't using REST, why would you want to expose a REST API in your app? What's the benefit of that?
It used to be the biggest reason people would write a REST API is when they wanted to integrate with a third party, some external company that wanted to be able to hit their services. But nowadays, with the days of the Angular front ends and the Vue.js front ends and just the single page apps, more and more commonly, people use a REST API just for their own website. They build kind of a ColdFusion based REST backend that just serves up JSON in sort of a stateless manner. Then they have a JavaScript front end that's consuming that. I find that to be as common of a scenario, and as well for mobile. You want to be able to have a mobile app just using the same sort of data. You can back it with that REST API.
Yeah, so it's a way to isolate different parts of your code from each other, so you could swap out the front end and keep the back end the same, or as you said, talk to third parties.
But it looks from the right ends that even CF Wheels and Preside CMS and Far Cry, I think, all have some little custom REST stuff of their own as well. So pretty much everybody's using some kind of REST tooling, and chances are it does a lot more than something you're going to write on your own.
Yeah, just to let folks know, if you go to the survey online, if you just click on the extra responses, you can view all the write-in answers and comments. So moving on from REST to question 33, what deployment build tools do you use?
Yeah, and these aren't mutually exclusive either. In fact, most people using Jenkins are probably using Ant inside of Jenkins, or even for Travis. There's a lot. See, what's our percentage not using is about 45%. We use Jenkins
So,
for
hmm
years.
hmm
It's just a general build tool for all of our box products. When I make a commit to command box, there's a Jenkins build that kicks off and builds all the binaries and runs all the tests. But lately, we've been investing a lot into Travis CI, and one of the biggest, it has a very tight integration with GitHub. One of the best
hmm
things with Travis, if you're an open source author, is when people send your product pull requests. As soon as they send the pull, a Travis CI build, which by the way is Docker based, it's a container that spins off in the cloud somewhere, right? I told you everything's using Docker these days. It'll spin up a container somewhere in the ether. It'll run all of your unit tests against the pull request that's being submitted to you, and it'll tell you right there in GitHub, test have passed or test have failed, which is great because it gives you instant feedback. Um, and so as an open source author, I really appreciate that. Someone sends me a pull request and I can tell them right away, well, you broke the build, come back and talk to me once the tests are passing, which is really great.
So the thing, for just to back up a moment, if people
Yeah.
aren't using build tools, which 44% of people taking the survey said that, and I've got to believe people who didn't take the survey, it's probably an even larger number, they're missing out on getting a reliable build made automatically, where every time you make a change to your code, it can run unit tests, it can, deploy it to different servers depending on how you've got the thing set up.
I think this
And it
is actually in the, is it Jeff Atwood? He had like 12 questions that every, applicant should ask a company, is your company doing this before I accept the job? And one of them is, can you create a build of your application with a single click?
Mhm.
Chances are, if you're not using one of these, you'd probably have to answer no to that.
Yeah, and the reason you wouldn't want to do this manually is it's very error prone and it's easy to forget to copy a file or to miscopy things or get settings wrong. And then
Well,
you have
sure.
bugs to track down that could be quite hard to track down.
Yeah, when I started working with Luis and with Coldbox, every time a new version of Coldbox was released, Luis would just do it manually on his computer. This was years ago, and a lot of companies are the same way. You kind of have one guy who knows all the stuff that has to happen to get into production.
Yeah.
And if anybody else needs to do a build, they're kind of screwed. And so that's why we started using Jenkins internally. With our products is because I
Yeah.
would say, well, how do I run a build? I don't have your computer in front of me. And so now it's all completely detached and, in a Jenkins job.
And it's now documented in that job scripting. So
Exactly. And anybody can run a build. If anybody wants to run build a command box, right, they can, clone the repository, run, an ant
and
command.
and what is the cost on Jenkins? Just for people who don't
uh,
know, and I might imagine it costs millions of dollars.
no, Jenkins, which is a fork of Hudson, is free. Travis
Yeah,
CI
exactly.
is also free as long as your projects are open source. Um, Ant is also free. It's an Apache product, right? And Ant is more, it's XML files you use to kind of describe what you want your build to do. So Ant is typically used inside of Travis or inside of Jenkins.
hmm
Bamboo is the Atlassian equivalent to Jenkins, kind of ties in with the Atlassian tool set. I'm not actually sure the pricing on Bamboo, to be honest.
But the
Um,
point I wanted to make was, if these, a lot of these options are open source or
yeah,
free,
there shouldn't be a
and
pricing barrier for sure.
right, and
Grunt
the
and Gulp are all node based. We actually use those specifically Grunt for a lot of our front end builds. We have an Elixir project now with Coldbox that deals with things like your style sheet, less than SAS compilations, your JavaScript minification, all that asset dealings that you do during a build. And so we use a lot of Grunt and Gulp, and of course there's no cost with that. Those are very popular. There's plugins for everything under the sun.
and then GitLab is a version of Git that has some of this stuff built in.
Yeah, it's sort of like a
Um,
self-hosted GitHub repository that you can have, behind a firewall on your own appliance. And it has its own kind of Jenkins-like automation built in. Jenkins lets you manually trigger builds or even schedule them. GitLab is, from my understanding, pretty much all just based on a commit that came in.
mhm.
So it's all based on the concept. You have a repository, somebody commits something to it, and you run a pipeline.
Yeah. Yeah. I just did a podcast episode with George Murphy, who's speaking into the
Oh,
box, and
George
he's
loves GitLab.
focusing on, yeah. Oh, yeah. He could talk forever about the features of GitLab, and he talked for quite a while, which was very interesting because I learned some stuff I hadn't heard about before. So, well, before we move on, sort of related to this is doing continuous integration, which a lot of these tools let you do. So why would someone want to do continuous integration?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea between continuous integration is all about closing that feedback loop between the amount of time that you write a line of code and the product is built and it's tested and you know whether or not it works. And that can be, feedback from a set of unit tests. It can be feedback from just a tester on your staging environment. But continuous integration is all about, I made a commit and let's run the unit test on those. Let's deploy that to the staging environment. Let's, use some, a JS lint, var scope, or whatever other, scanning tools you want to run. And let's automate it so it's not a manual process, as opposed to saying, oh, I need to push that code to stage and it's so much work, I'll wait till Friday to do it. It should just happen. There's no reason why your code can't be on your staging server within, 5 minutes of you committing it without you lifting a finger.
And already had all the unit tests pass as well.
Yeah, because if the unit tests don't pass, it shouldn't be deployed. The build should be failed, and you should be notified. Because I mean, why have a human bother testing your code when your unit tests have already told you that they're failing now? So, it's all about automating, reducing those feedback cycles.
Yeah, improving code quality. Well, let's go on to the salary question, which I think we managed to. We got some interesting numbers here, but really,
yeah, we screwed this one up.
We need to extend the. Yeah, we screwed this up. So,
yeah, so we
didn't have enough
underestimated
answers.
What ColdFusion developers make. So next year we need to bump this baby up to like $1 million, I guess, to
there you
to
go.
Get better data.
So most people, nearly half the people were making more than 95K a year, and then there was a pretty even distribution all the way down to 25K, which I hope was on a kind of intern hobby level.
There's a couple unpaid, but I mean, I think this is great news for ColdFusion developers. I mean, if someone's considering, should I, develop in ColdFusion, I think this goes along with the other question that said it's difficult to find ColdFusion developers, right? So I said, I mean, it's a market to be hired in. So people are willing to pay to try to get people to come be a ColdFusion developer. And so I think this is good news for people with ColdFusion skills. And so hopefully next year we'll distribute the answers a bit higher up in the range to get some better data.
Yeah. So let's move on to those controversial security questions.
Yes.
Question 35. How do you lock down your servers for security? Check all apply. So most popular answer.
We need to shoot the 17 people that said none. What's security?
Yeah. Well, people, you say shoot them. They aren't alone. I mean, the people who took this survey tend to be the most clued in ColdFusion developers who are on forums or on the Slack channel. The people who just do a regular 9-to-5 job, I bet you it's more than 3.8% don't do anything for security. I know it's the case because I've talked with some of them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the official lockdown guide is great. Pete Freitag, again, helps write those. He's the author of FuseGuard and the hackmycf.com. A lot of people just don't even know those exist. I mean, they're freely available PDFs that literally give you screenshot, step-by-step, Apache, IIS, you name it, everything you need to do to lock down. And if everybody followed just the off-the-shelf lockdown guides, majority of ColdFusion hacks, if everybody followed the guides and updated their server to recent updates, the majority of ColdFusion hacks wouldn't even happen in the first place.
And that recent updates has two parts. One is the hot fixes that Adobe or Lucy put out when a hack is discovered, and they quickly put out something. And they both do a great job of that. They don't cover up that there's been a hack. They put out that hot fix and send out an alert.
Yeah, the transparency sometimes it kind of feels like it can hurt the image. Because every time Adobe gets it's a security exploit, which isn't very often, to be honest, it's very highly publicized. But I mean, that's good because you want people to know about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, the secure profile is another good one. I think more people need to be using that. Now, it's possible that not enough people are on the newer versions of ColdFusion that have the secure profile.
Yeah, and I was going to say there are two parts to this. First of all, you want to get the hot fixes as they come out, and Hack My CF will alert you to that by email. But the other thing is you need to get off end of life ColdFusion, which means CF9 or earlier, and CF10 is going to go end of life
CF10
pretty
is really
soon.
soon, yeah. So, I mean,
Yeah.
ColdFusion 11, 2016 both had the secure profile. And when you install ColdFusion, it asks you, is this a production server? I mean, so many people forget just the obvious stuff like a custom error template, for their site. They're outputting all
Yeah.
sorts of, juicy information for hackers and looking like noobs at the same time. And, secure profile sets a whole handful of settings just right off the bat that will make your server twice as secure. And also in ColdFusion 2016, let's say you're using it behind IIS, one of the most common installations. They've now blocked access to the entire CFIDE folder by default. You can't even get to it. The IIS connector won't even hit it, which, I mean, they should have done years ago. But I like these secure by default things. It makes using it slightly more complicated. You got to hit it directly through Tomcat, but in my opinion, those things are way worth it. Because ColdFusion installs back in the day just weren't secure by default, and most people didn't lock them down.
So let's go on to the what happens if you don't have things secure. So next question 36. Have your ColdFusion servers suffered from a hacking exploit in the last 2 years due to a CF-based vector? And this was an anonymous question. So yes. I'm glad to say 90% of people haven't had this, but that meant 10% of people have been hacked, which is upsetting, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, overall, I'm very glad to see, a lot of no's. I'll hear a lot from pen testers and people in the community that are not ColdFusion developers. They widely regard ColdFusion as just a very insecure platform. Any ColdFusion server is just, immediately hackable. There's, and that's not the case statistically. ColdFusion has a very low number of exploits, and I think this is a good graph. So I was very interested to see, out of the people who were hacked, what was the reason. And so, the most answered one is lack of ColdFusion patching, which isn't that surprising. And it's sad because that's one of the easiest ones to do. In ColdFusion now, you can even configure it to literally email you when new patches come out. I mean, you'll get an email in your inbox that says, here's an update. And people who just don't patch it, 4% of people who were hacked, or not 4% of people who were hacked, 4% of people who answered the question were hacked because they simply didn't install the updates. So,
yeah, and then other, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, like that thing you mentioned earlier, where the admin is publicly available, other vulnerabilities in the code.
And the public administrator, also incredibly easy to lock down. A lot of people just don't do it. The only people I can really feel sorry for is a very small, less than 2%, that say they were actually hacked by an actual unpatched 0-day in the engine itself. And Adobe usually has patches available within 2 weeks or less when a 0-day has come out in the past. So that's usually a very small window. The remaining people who get hacked just simply don't apply the updates.
To be honest, when I've looked at hacks that have happened against ColdFusion, it's not day zero stuff. It's stuff that's been out for 6 months, a year, even longer. Or they're using CF9, which doesn't receive hot fixes anymore because it went end of life.
Yeah.
And you're never going to get hot fixes for that. And
every
people
company
just have holes in their setup.
Sure. In my opinion, every company, especially companies that have a segregated wall between developers and the DevOps guy that do the servers, they've got to have at least one person at the company whose responsibility it is to keep on updates, whether it's Windows updates or Linux updates, Apache updates, or ColdFusion updates. Somebody's got to, have a schedule where they go through and they check them all on a regular basis. It's the people who deploy a server and just leave it out there for years, that they get hammered on this.
And there's one other thing I'd say on this. The question said, have you, do you know you've had a hacking exploit? I have to tell you, when we've gone in and helped people who've been hacked, several of them they were hacked. The hack, when we dug into how did they get in and how long's this been going on, they were hacked like 6 months earlier. And it's only when the hackers started uploading wares or pornography or whatever on their server, and they blew out the disk space. Then and the server started crashing. Then they understood they'd been hacked. But and that's actually very common. There've been some famous hackings. I don't know if it was North Carolina or South Carolina state government, but one of those Carolinas, they were hacked like 6 months previously, and it took them that long to even discover. So I just want to, if people are sitting there thinking, oh yeah, I haven't been hacked, that may not be true.
It's entirely possible. And there are some good softwares out there, like Tripwire, that will try to detect malicious activity to notify you immediately if it looks like something's going on your server.
Yeah. So I definitely recommend that. Let me just... All right. So moving on. Next question. ColdFusion communities. So these are online communities. Question 37. Online communities that you're part of. And most popular one is the Slack channel, which last time I checked was a few thousand people in it. So very active.
Let's see here. I look right now. ColdFusion Slack. 1,972 people currently in it. So right under 2,000.
Wow. And that's a great place to share useful information or to get answers to questions. So, and then second one here, there's some framework specific ones, and then there's also some Facebook groups that are pretty popular. So,
yeah, I mean, overall, I think there's probably a lot of people who aren't in communities, but those are the kind of people who didn't take the survey because they weren't in the communities to know about the survey in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, typically people either heard about it through one of these communities by other people sharing it there, or they were on the Teretic email list. Or I don't know if this happened on this year, but previous years, I know Integral sent out an email to their email list as well. Or maybe they saw a tweet on it. There were quite a few tweets as well, which we regarded as a community, because if you use the ColdFusion or CFML hashtag, it's going to pick up traffic.
Mm-hmm. All right, I've got a few minutes left on this end, so let's...
Yes, we're nearly at the end. So professional development time versus hobby time. Most people taking this are focused on professional time. And then hobby time, so that's open source projects or your own thing. Not so many people doing that.
So it seems that most people doing CF professionally is kind of mostly what they focus on, but a lot of people doing CF in their hobby appear to focus on a lot of other languages in their hobby time, which is not a bad thing.
Yeah. And then how do people work? Are they salaried, contract, self-employed? So most people taking the survey were salaried, but fair chunk contract or got their own business.
I think a lot of the people who are self-employed probably also were contractors. They probably, contract for themselves.
Yep. And then surprised that only 14% are remote. So
yeah, there's a lot more people that would probably work remote if there were positions available.
And then very few are unemployed, which relates to that high demand for ColdFusion developers. And then hardly anyone said they were a student, which I'd love to see that change, because that's how we get fresh blood.
I would too. Yeah, that's exactly where I started ColdFusion as a student. So I agree with you there.
And then we're at the final question, so which is any additional comments, and there were a lot of write-in comments. So maybe we're not going to scroll through all of those. If people are interested, they can do that. But perhaps we can just highlight some ones that really caught your eye, and I'm just gonna see if I can stop the screen share so we can scroll down through those comments. And so let's look at 3 top themes that called out to us from these comments, Brad.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones are just people looking for better support for ColdFusion and just marketing. And I think there's always more that Lucy and Adobe can do in marketing, but I think Adobe or Lucy can never do the same kind of marketing that you and I can do. Just as developers from a grassroots perspective, being a part of user. going to conferences.
Isn't that what every open source language that competes with ColdFusion does?
But yeah, there's a lot of languages that don't have a corporate entity to market for them. They were grown up out of just masses of people saying, hey, I'm working on this really cool language called blah, take a look at it. And that's how they grew the community. So I think that's something that everybody can do, for sure, to help that on their own.
And we've got another number of people here who said they either love ColdFusion or bring CFML to the masses. Mm-hmm. So a lot of enthusiasm about ColdFusion. I noticed that in a number of the write-in comments.
Yes, as well. Yeah, I'm seeing several mentions of Lucy, people being excited about that.
So maybe we just need to tie those two things together, the people who are really enthusiastic about ColdFusion and the people who wish it was marketed better, and get that message out that it's a wonderful language and something to be proud of doing.
Yeah, I think, ways people can do that can involve finding a local user group, even maybe just an open source user group or, a generic programming user group, and just being a part of it and, just talking about ColdFusion, or, going to a local conference that's not a ColdFusion conference, and talking to people about what you do.
Or starting a meetup if there isn't one. They're very easy to start.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a town with enough ColdFusion developers, you can talk with, Alicia Dvorak from Adobe and, try to, even start an official Adobe meetup, ColdFusion, or it doesn't have to be official. It can just be, you inviting people to, talk about the cool stuff that's going on.
And for people who don't have other people in town, the Southern Florida ColdFusion user group went virtual a few years back, and anyone can attend their meetings.
That's nice. Can't say his name. Charlie Earhart also has the online CF meetup, and they don't meet on a regular basis, but as needed when he has speakers. And that's a group you can do online as well.
Yeah, so lots of resources. The Southern ColdFusion one, I think, has a round table format where people bring the coding problem they have. So they don't have a speaker unless one turns up, but they do meet every month, I believe. And that's run by Gian Carlos Gomez, who I interviewed for the podcast the other day.
Yeah, JC is a cool guy.
Yeah. All right. So that's it for another ColdFusion State of the Union survey 2017. Thank you, Brad, for your great commentary. And looking forward to what's going to change next year in this.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.